Good evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. I'm Jeff Schumacher. I'm the Vice President of Exhibits and Programs here, and it's great to see such a big crowd for tonight's event. I think you'll be very pleased to have come down to the museum for this today. Our speaker tonight will be discussing one of my personal favorite topics, which is organized crime before Prohibition. It's common to hear people say that the mob got its start during Prohibition, right? But that is decidedly not the case. Yes, Prohibition helped the mob grow substantially, but the criminal underworld existed long before the 18th Amendment took effect in 1920. As one would expect, an early hotbed of organized crime was New York City. Street gangs emerged as early as the 1840s, but things really heated up when waves of European immigrants arrived from the 1880s through the early 1900s. An important part of that story is how law enforcement in its fledgling state responded to the rise of organized crime. This is where our speaker, Paul Moses, picks up the story. Paul is a former reporter and editor at New York Newsday, and today he is a professor emeritus of journalism at Brooklyn College. His latest book is titled The Italian Squad, The True Story of the Immigrant Cops Who Fought the Rise of the Mafia. The Italian Squad is essential reading if you want to learn more about organized crime and law enforcement in this pre-Prohibition era. And it's a great book if you're looking to be inspired by a few genuine American heroes as well. Please join me in welcoming Paul Moses.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and thanks very much for having me here, and also thanks to Shakela Alvarenga for her help in arranging everything we're doing here. Thank you for coming also. In walking around the museum, I noticed the exhibit about Joseph Petrosino. Did you spot that, any of you? Well, you can check it out. He was a Italian immigrant who became a detective in New York, and really he's in the history books because of his role in investigating kind of what I would guess the early beginnings of organized crime, Italian organized crime in New York. And the Italian Squad was a group of Italian immigrant detectives that the NYPD pulled together in 1904. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about their story, starting with Petrosino, and it goes up until 1922. So that's kind of the early part of the Prohibition, and that's when the squad was disbanded, and we can kind of talk about why that happened. Let's see. It follows on a book I did earlier on a history of New York's Irish and Italians. And in that book, I had a chapter on Joseph Petrosino, looked at from the point of view of what it was like for an Italian to advance in the NYPD, which was Irish-dominated. And the book kind of goes into the history of antagonism between the Irish and the Italians in New York. The Irish were an immigrant group that came somewhat earlier than the Italians in big numbers starting after 1880. And that antagonism covers a lot of areas. It's in the workplace, in unions, in the church, in crime, and also in the NYPD. And in reading about Petrosino, I just wanted to tell more of the story of the Italian Squad and go beyond Petrosino to follow the commanding officers who followed him over the coming years. So that's kind of the big picture of the book that I'll be talking about. So here you see Joseph Petrosino as a very young man, and a picture of him as a young police officer. He was recruited for the force by a man named Alex Williams, inspector, nicknamed Clubber. If you're familiar with him, if you've ever seen The Gangs of New York, you know that scene where the officer hangs his watch on a post and is dangling there, and he walks away and comes back and it's still there because everybody was afraid of him. That's Williams. So he was a very tough cop. He saw the need, though, to have some Italians in the police force. There were just about none. And at that time, the police department was under the street cleaning department was under the police department in New York. And Petrosino was working on the garbage scows. And Williams got him into the police department. Petrosino kind of languishes in the police department for a while on patrol. And then in 1895, there's a big shakeup of the Detective Bureau. The head of the Police Board of Commissioners was Teddy Roosevelt, and he was interested in Petrosino and promoted him to detective. And he quickly becomes a star detective. This is a photo that is actually downstairs, that's actually in the museum also. And you see Petrosino on the end. He's got a suspect in what was kind of like the crime of the year, or maybe the decade in New York, called the barrel murder, where the victim was found in a barrel and chopped up. And Petrosino breaks open the case by identifying the victim, which took a good bit of detective work. So he becomes quite famous, and that's actually captured in this photo because next to Petrosino is one of the suspects. Then the next fellow over is Arthur Carey, who was one of the star detectives of the NYPD. He later became the head of the Homicide Bureau when that was formed. And next to him is a fellow named McCafferty, who goes on to become an inspector and the chief of detectives. So they were kind of the two star detectives of the day, and for Petrosino to even be paired with them as an Italian was like kind of a big thing. In those days, Petrosino was kind of treated with derision when they would call him in for, put him on a case. When they felt they needed him, they would say, "Send for the Dago." Okay. Now, so this case, the barrel murder, is very significant because it was not solved. The supervisors ordered the arrest too early, and they really couldn't make the charges stick. But the people who were responsible for this murder, you'll see, will come to play a big part in the story of the Italian squad. There were these people: Ignazio Lupo, Giuseppe Morello, and Vito Cascioferro. Lupo and Morello, they are the beginnings of true mafia, organized crime presence in New York. It really was not there at this point. When I say mafia, I mean the mafia in Sicily, okay? There was no American mafia at this point. Lupo and Morello were not typical of the Italian immigrants who came over from Sicily. They were actually somewhat prosperous business people, middle class, I would say. Lupo ran a large business that imported olive oil and other goods. Morello was kind of the tougher guy. You see, he had a maimed hand. And Cascioferro was a real Sicilian mafia don, politically influential, quite powerful. They were behind this murder in the barrel murder because it was part of they were running a counterfeiting ring, and there were some problems within that ring, and the man in the barrel named Benedetto Madonia ran afoul of them. So just keep that back there because they come back to the story. Now, Petrosino, as the exhibit downstairs will tell you, is remembered for battling the Black Hand. And I found in researching it, there were always a lot of misconceptions about what the Black Hand was. So here's a news clipping from the New York World of the first Black Hand case. It involves a shakedown of a successful Italian immigrant who ran a contracting business. And there are always these kinds of shakedowns in immigrant communities where one group of criminals preys on their fellow immigrants. What was unusual about this case was that the criminals had the idea of signing their blackmail letter as coming from the Society of the Black Hand, the Mano Negra, right? There was really no society. It was just these guys came up with an idea that would be scary. Well, sure enough, the police make arrests in this case. There's a lieutenant in Brooklyn named Anthony Vachris, also an Italian immigrant, who solved the case right away. We'll be hearing about him in a bit. But what's unique about this case is that the papers really started inflating the Black Hand into an international criminal conspiracy, right? It's really not. But the bad guys out there in Italian immigrant communities, really around the country, started to recognize that, gee, if I'm trying to do a shakedown and I send the letter as being from the Black Hand, it's gonna scare the heck out of people. So it did take effect, and there were a lot of serious crimes going on, but these were really mostly somewhat amateur criminals, and but it definitely was not a conspiracy being run from Italy, from Sicily, or from Naples, where the Camorra was, a real organized crime conspiracy. And so this is kind of a fact of life of the Italian squad. And you just see how it's blown up. One day's, this is from one of the Hearst papers, one day's investigation by reporters of this is the New York American and the New York Journal, the two Hearst papers in New York, into the deeds of the Black Hand branch that makes its headquarters in Brooklyn, because that case was a Brooklyn case, has shown how grave are the reasons actuating the police of this city, Philadelphia, Boston, Chicago, all these other places, and that these groups, they're planning a widespread coup for the obliteration of the Mafia in America. This was not actually happening in real life, okay? The Mafia in America was not everywhere yet. I'm not saying it didn't become very widespread and influential, but not yet. So anyway, the person who can deal with this, and there are a lot of bombings going on, kidnappings, it's scary stuff. I don't want to minimize the crimes that the police were left to deal with. And the police were not so good at handling cases in the Italian community, and the Italian community was not so good about cooperating with the police. There's historical reasons for the Italians not to cooperate with police because of the situation in their homeland, where the police were kind of perceived as part of a state that was oppressing Southern Italians and led them to mass migration. And on the police side, first of all, there were just differences of language. And there, like I said, there is this overarching antagonism of the more settled Irish, maybe German communities toward these newcomers who are working for less money and working their way up in construction jobs and housing and so forth. So the newspapers really began to campaign for the police department to do something about this. And so did the Italian community, the business leaders and so forth. These were the people who were the most vulnerable to these shakedowns. And so in 1904, we do get the formation of the Italian squad. And this is a picture from the records of the Petrosino family of the officers who were first on the squad. The commissioner, his name was McAdoo, was not especially anxious to do this because Tammany Hall kind of had a lock on the police department in a lot of ways in those days, and control promotions, and Tammany Hall had alliances with gangs, that had been going on for a long time, so to create this bureau that was kind of working outside the chain of command in the detective bureau, Tammany was not too excited about this. So the squad was not very big, and it had a huge job to do because there are, huge numbers of Italians moving into New York City. let's see. So during this time, Petrosino is continuing to keep close watch on Lupo and Morello, those gangsters I showed you earlier. And I think his reason for this is that he was very alert to any gang activity that did have connections to the Mafia, the real Mafia in Sicily, right? And those guys did have those connections. So he was on them a lot. And, he would harass them, and, they passed death threats about him. Until finally one day, Petrosino confronted Lupo about the death threats and beat him up in the street, humiliating him. In 1906, there's a new police commissioner named. The politics in New York City had changed again somewhat. The mayor, his name was McClellan, George B. McClellan, Jr. You might hear an echo of a name, His father was a Civil War general who was not one of the Union Army's best generals and who ran against Lincoln for president in 1864. Anyway, Mayor McClellan was, trying to, I think, clear his family name a bit, and he was, a significant politician, talked about maybe even for president. And he started to back away from Tammany. He barely won re-election against Hearst, who was running against him, the publisher. And Hearst, painted him as a tool of the machine and all that. And it wasn't, if he was going to go on to bigger and better things, he couldn't be perceived as a tool of the machine. So he backed away, and he names a police commissioner who was kind of very honest, but tactless. His name was Bingham, General Bingham. He had been a general. He was friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt had little regard for him. And I kind of describe him in shorthand as kind of a minor league Teddy Roosevelt, because he had all the bluster, but not the sense and finesse that Teddy Roosevelt had. But he was charging in, all right? He was trying to take on this Black Hand problem. And so he expands the Italian squad quite a bit. And part of the plan is to use a new immigration law to deport some of the people who are making life miserable for the Italian immigrants. What happened was, we're beginning to get kind of an anti-immigrant, restrict immigration thing starting to happen in the 1900s, the first decade there. And one of the early laws that did pass through was if somebody came into the United States and had a criminal record in their home country, that person could be deported within 3 years of their arrival. And for Petrosino, this was like a very helpful thing, because Petrosino had very good contacts in the Italian community. People came in and talked to him, but they were reluctant to testify. They didn't trust that the police could really protect them. And, so Petrosino was very frustrated. He knew a lot more than he could prove in court. But to get these people out of the way, all he needed was a piece of paper from Italy proving that, they had a criminal record in Italy. That would solve the problem with that particular. And he really felt very strongly that the whole Black Hand problem boiled down to a few individuals, well, a small number of people, let's put it that way, who came over from Italy with a record to escape Italian justice, which was quite harsh. Okay, so in other words, it's a small number of people who are causing this problem, which he knew was very injurious to the reputation of Italian immigrants in America. And he was one of them. He valued his people. So decision is made. Oh, here we see Bingham. Mayor McClellan is giving awards out with Bingham in the top hat. And that's Big Tim Sullivan. He was a very colorful and interesting Tammany Hall leader for the Lower East Side, very involved with gambling and consequently with the police department. Had alliances with gangs. Also sort of a heart of gold, who helped all these immigrants and gave them shoes. Fascinating character. I'm surprised there's no musical about him. And he, so he's on the other side of this. And so Bingham not only wanted to expand the Italian squad, but to set up what he called a secret service that would report only to him. And the Tammany people were not going to fund that because they knew Bingham would use it to investigate them. So the decision is made to send Petrosino to Italy to get these documents. And so you see there that unfortunately, it came out in the newspapers by way of Bingham that Petrosino had gone to Italy, which was a terrible mistake by Commissioner Bingham because the mission was supposed to be secret. And so when Petrosino arrives he visited his hometown, Padula, which is in the Campania area of Italy, southern Italy. And when he gets there, his brother says, "Oh, it's been in the newspapers." You know, he's really upset. But he continues with his mission, and part of that involves going down to Palermo, Sicily, and he's murdered there. Okay, and this is really struck a chord in the whole country that he went to Italy, you know, in the line of duty, and was murdered. And here you see the telegram that comes over. The State Department records were very helpful to me because any communications between New York police and Italy police went through the State Department. That's why Petrosino had to go there in the first place. The system was too cumbersome to work, right? And here you see that the telegram it originates with the U.S. consul in Palermo. And what's interesting is this has certainly been written zillions of times about Petrosino. All the newspapers at the time, many books. Petrosino is so famous. You know, maybe you saw the movie Pay or Die, where Ernest Borgnine plays him. There are movies, comic strips, venture serials, plays, everything about him. But they always end the quote, "dies martyr." I found it interesting that it continues to say, why was he a martyr? He was protecting peaceful Italians in America. That was his mission. That's what he died for. Here's a postcard of the area where he was fatally shot. It was at nighttime, though. The Piazza Marina in Palermo. This postcard was in the records of the U.S. consul for Palermo. And here is an image of it. The sad thing was that Petrosino, who was 48 and not in great physical shape, he'd been coming off an illness, I don't know if bronchitis or pneumonia, something lung-related. He wasn't really looking to go on this trip. He shouldn't have been sent alone. They shouldn't have let the word get out. It's a sad thing. But there he is. He'd just been married not long before, and he had an infant daughter who was 8 weeks old. And so there he is, pictured with his wife. And I'm told that's probably not really his infant daughter. My wife Maureen and I, we actually were friendly for quite a while with Petrosino's granddaughter without actually knowing that she was Petrosino's granddaughter. My wife worked with her in Brooklyn, and I showed her this picture one day. She says, "Oh no, that's not my mother." So, so I don't know. The world got creative and put another baby in there. But here you see Petrosino being remembered with a postcard at that time. And, you know, for one day, the city really came together. The Irish and the Italians stood side by side, and everybody mourned Petrosino. But in the long run, I think the lesson that a lot of people took away from this was that if a great detective like Petrosino could be murdered by these gangsters, who's safe? So it just kind of increased the level of worry that people had about the Italian immigrants. And I should add that I am a grandson of Italian immigrants from Basilicata and Calabria. So there's this huge funeral, and then here you just see some things from the Petrosino family records about different shows and movies and plays and everything about Joseph Petrosino. And so that's actually where I start the book, is with the assassination of Petrosino, because he's been written about quite a bit elsewhere. I started there, he appears throughout the story kind of in flashback, but I really wanted to focus on the three who headed the squad after him. They were all close to Petrosino when he was alive, influenced by him, very, very much so, and really, like Petrosino, became national celebrities as detectives. They were all really top detectives. So I wanted to tell more of their story. And that fellow in the upper corner on the right, Anthony Vachris, he is sent within 3 days. The police commissioner sends him back to Italy to keep going on Petrosino's mission. But this time they sent him with another cop, a big Irish guy who had learned Italian on the job, Crowley. Crowley was in a special honor squad of cops who were taller than 6 feet tall, which at the time was pretty tall, right? So Vachris, I'll talk to you about Vachris first. That's him in the middle there, kind of facing to the side, kibitzing. Let's see. He's sent on this mission. That's Arthur Woods. He's a deputy commissioner. Interesting guy. He was like a Harvard guy, came from very, blue blood background, eventually marries a great niece or something of J.P. Morgan, and he had a real interest in police work and studied it, but he was not like a cop kind of guy. And he eventually becomes the commissioner of the NYPD. And so you see here, Petrosino is murdered March 12th. Word arrives in New York the 13th. By the 16th, he's writing his diary on that boat to Italy. And I was fortunate to get a copy of this from the Vachris family, because what Vachris did on this trip was so misrepresented in the newspapers. I hate to say it because I was a reporter myself. And so you just see here in this diary where he talks about how as he got to the boat, there was a police captain he knew who recognized him, and he's like petrified that he's going to give a signal and say hello. And he just writes there, I hope he has the brains not to say anything to anybody. He really wants to keep it secret. And then he runs into, on the boat, there's a former deputy commissioner named Waldo, who enters the story later. He becomes commissioner. He happens just to be on the boat, so he's worried about that too. And when he gets to Italy, there's Vachris in the middle, and he's kind of sandwiched between his boss, Bingham, with the pipe, and Angelo Leonardi, who is like the head of national police in Italy. He's like kind of the head of the FBI or something. He's an aristocrat, and Leonardi does not want to send any more American police down to Sicily, okay? He's really worried about that. Meanwhile, the commissioner really wants Vachris to go back. I think they want the optic of having him in Palermo. Not so much Bingham, but I think actually the mayor, McClellan, it was the one pressing for that. And but Leonardi and Vachris kind of become friendly. They like each other. And, Vachris is sort of out of his element here. He's doing what really a diplomat should be doing. But he carries it off with some finesse. And Leonardi agrees to get him all the records he needs, because that was the reason he came. And sure enough, Leonardi really gets it, even the ones from Sicily. So here you see in his diary, Vachris is noting how he was upset that he's getting flack from his bosses back in New York. And he says at the bottom of the first one, still we are on the ground, and going to the second one, and he is not. All right, if he was here, he thinks that the commissioner and the deputy commissioner would agree with him. So I don't know if any of you were involved in police work, but I have no experience at it other than writing about it, but it seems like a classic position that, the cop in the field will often feel that, well, if they could just get it, just illustrates the world that Vachris stepped into here. That's a photo of the the Interior Ministry where he was going to work each day. It's a splendid building. And just a little note from his diary where he talks about he misses the good American coffee and tea. Everything here is macaroni with a big M. Every time you ask for soup, you get macaroni water. And the coffee is thick and almost, he doesn't like the coffee. And I was like, wow, who's ever been to Rome where they didn't like the food? But I said, to me, that really proves that Vachris was a fully assimilated American if he could go over there and say that. So, and these guys are really about assimilation. They're into being American. Meanwhile, Bingham gets thrown out of his job in the police department. The politics changed again. Mayor McClellan needed help from the head of the Brooklyn Democratic Organization, since the Manhattan organization, which is Tammany Hall, was not backing him anymore. And this judge in the middle, William J. Gaynor, kind of leads a crusade against Bingham for his use of the Rogues Gallery. The Rogues Gallery was kind of an early database for police. The police would, anybody arrested would get photographed, and fingerprinting was just starting in, but they would do this other thing called the Bertillon method, which they would take a couple of hundred measurements of every part of a person's body and have a complete measured profile of them. And the problem with this was that people who weren't yet convicted were in this database, and the police would come into to the office detective bureau in the morning, and they'd be working on a case, and they'd kind of size up suspects off this board. And anyway, Judge Gaynor really felt strongly about this, and the mayor used that, I think, as an excuse to get rid of Bingham. I think it was just an excuse, actually. It's kind of interesting because we often run into controversies from back then that foreshadow modern controversies. Like now the discussion would be about gang databases that police use, right? So a new commissioner comes in, and he really pushes the Italian squad down, starts getting rid of all the cops. That's Commissioner Waldo. Waldo was a society guy, Rhinelander Waldo. And I think he was kind of scoffed at in the papers. You see a cartoon about him there. It's kind of a little sheep with the system. That's the organized system of payoffs, just kind of preying on him. So the Italian, he stops the Italian squad, and this is a story from the New York Evening Post. Crime increases in the city. Vachris has complained about the end of the Italian squad. He's even testified about it before a Brooklyn grand jury that investigates this. And he's punished by being sent out of the detective bureau to patrol, and then transferred to City Island in the Bronx. I don't know if you know New York, you know that it's pretty remote towards the top of the northern part of the city. It's an island up there. Lovely place to get a seafood meal, by the way, if you're in New York. But and Vachris lives in Brooklyn. If you know Brooklyn, the neighborhood he lived in is now called Sunset Park. In those days, getting up there, subway's in its infancy still. He had to take, it was like a 4-hour trip. He had to take, there was even a part of it where I think he had to take a rail car that was pulled by a horse or something like that, and a boat. And in police jargon today, the cops call it highway therapy, right? They get mad at somebody, they put them far away from where they live. Anyway, the Post is noting about a crimes increase in the city, and they ask, you see at the end of the article, where is Tony Vachris, the best blackhand expert we've had since Joseph Petrosino died? He's at City Island. So Vachris had a difficult time in the police department. I think we may come back to him, but he was a fine detective. The one I'd like to focus on now is Charles Correo. He's the one who's standing there. And Correo was heading the Brooklyn unit of the Italian squad. And one of the important things he does is he assists William Flynn in investigating the counterfeiting ring headed by Lupo and Morello. So Vachris is doing all that stuff. Correo is doing this, okay? And I don't know if you saw that the museum has some really neat stuff from William Flynn, who was one of the star law enforcement officials of the first quarter of the 20th century. At that time, he was head of the Secret Service office in New York. He eventually becomes head of the entire Secret Service. And then around 1919, 20, he becomes head of the federal, small F at that time, Bureau of Investigation, the predecessor of the FBI. And downstairs they have his wiretapping kit in the museum downstairs, which I was like, whoa. Correo assists him in investigating the Lupo Morello gang. And Correo, to his credit, is holding the, there's no official Italian squad, although the newspapers keep referring to one. And I get, maybe this happens in any bureaucracy. I know it happens in the New York police, where sometimes something supposedly doesn't exist, but it exists in sort of a shadow state, because there's still a function that they needed of having a unit of officers who were trained in fighting a particular kind of crime. And so Correo is really the one who holds it together, with some help from the Italian squad, although the bulk of the credit goes to Flynn. They do get convictions of Lupo and Morello and their associates, and they get very long prison terms for counterfeiting. One got, I forget which is which now, one got 25 years, one got 30 years. The sentences came down to this very melodramatic hearing where, was it Morello fainted and Lupo cried his eyes out? I don't remember, but so you see them there. This is a sketch from the Italian newspaper Il Progresso. They did great sketches in that paper. And Lupo is the second one and Morello is the fourth one. They're supposed to be on the train taking them to the federal prison in Atlanta. And so 1 year after Petrosino's murder, there is some sense that justice was done in that Lupo and Morello were convicted and sent to prison for serious term. And here you see 1 year later, there's a monument being unveiled to Petrosino at his grave in Queens. Now, bombings remained a problem, and Correo developed a lot of expertise on them. In the 1910s, the gangs are becoming more sophisticated. And here you see a fellow named Costabile, who Petrosino and Correo had been chasing him for quite a while. They caught a guy named Pinzolo who was setting off a bomb. They caught him in the act, and Correo defused it. And this guy Pinzolo, Correo knew that he hung around with this guy Costabile, and Pinzolo told them flat out, yeah, Costabile is the head, but I'm not going to testify. And he went up and did his time in Sing Sing and later got out and became a fairly significant gangster in the early 1920s. So here is a big case where Correo comes up to him on the street and goes through his pockets, finds this bomb, and this. Have you heard of the Sullivan Law? I bet maybe you have, right? Remember the Supreme Court issued a major gun control case. Was it last year? Bruin, B-R-U-E-N case. It overturned the Sullivan Law. So the Sullivan Law was just coming into effect in 1911. It was the work of Big Tim Sullivan, right? He got it passed. Why he wanted a gun control law, nobody knows, because he had all these alliances with the gangs, but he may have felt it was kind of dangerous for these guys to be walking around with guns too and push for this law. Nobody can understand Sullivan's motives, but for whatever reason it was, Sullivan got this law passed. It was on the books for a long, long time. It was one of the earliest gun control laws, and the Supreme Court reviewed it and just pretty recently threw it out. Anyway, this was one of the very first arrests under the Sullivan Law. It was not a gun. The weapon in this case was the bomb. There's Correo later in his career. You see his medals. Well, he did another one of those cases where he arrested somebody in the act of bombing, somebody who had lit the fuse. He diffused it. And so for this, and the earlier case with Costabile, Correo won the Medal of Honor. So in the NYPD, that's the highest award that you can get. And he was actually the first officer to receive it. The reward happened to be started in that year. And I don't know if it was by design, but he was the first online also. So he was the first recipient of the NYPD's highest honor. What's kind of interesting about Correo is that back when he was first starting out, he started out on the police force of the city of Brooklyn, when it was a separate city from New York, right? And there was a case he was involved in on a pretty significant gang figure in Brooklyn. And the local paper carried this big article that quoted an unnamed captain who's named in other parts of the story about an unnamed Italian policeman. You see under the headline, "Why Italians Are Useless in Police Work." He's eventually accusing this unnamed Italian officer of being a coward, right? It's pretty clear, it's clear that it was Correo he's referring to. And Correo's older brother, was a lawyer and a very outspoken fellow in the Italian community. He eventually organized the Italian community in Brooklyn politically, and he became the first assistant district attorney in Brooklyn who was Italian. Well, he read this, and he wrote a blistering letter about this. So I just thought it was an interesting part of the story because it showed some of the resistance that the Italian detectives did face as they came up the line, and then he does become recognized for his bravery. So now, as the gangs are starting to grow in the teens, and this is the Navy Street gang in Brooklyn. So Navy Street is be down kind of near the Manhattan Bridge. Navy Street's where Al Capone grew up also. And although this is not his period. So Correo and the other Italian cops are investigating what is really a mob war between these folks here and the continuing Lupo Morello crime family, right? Because they had other relatives. Some of them were named Terra Nova, if you may recognize that name if you follow mob history. But so there was a mob war. There were a number of murders going on. What was happening at this point is that these gangs are starting to move in to businesses. They want to take over the trade for artichokes or hay for the stables or coal, or so they're going past the ice was another thing. They're going past just that stage of terrorizing storekeepers, okay? And they even, they have lawyers ready on call now. So it's starting to look a little bit more like what we associate with, kind of the mafia figures we see in the museum here. And the Italian cops turned a informant named Ralph Daniello, who testifies about 23 murders. Not like he was there at the scene. It was like kind of hearsay, but it does help to lay out a roadmap for the police. He also said he heard talk about police being bribed. The conduit was a guy named Ferrara. If you know New York, there's a very famous pastry shop, and he was the owner of it. He started it. It's still there, and I recommend it. But so that's going on. He was kind of a vile character, Ralph Daniello. He's on the top. He started having an affair with this underage girl, and with the mob war breaking out, he used it as an excuse to send his wife and child to Italy for safekeeping. And he eventually takes her off to Philadelphia and marries her, and the girl's mother is very angry and goes to the police. And they tried to prosecute Daniello for bigamy. They had a lot of cases against him. There were robbery cases and drug cases, and he brings in a guy who looks a little like Daniello to testify that, no, I was the one who married her, and gets away with it. But then the DA is really furious, and he gets to the bottom of it and indicts that other guy who came in for perjury. He's convicted, and they're looking for Daniello, and that's when he flees. He flees to Reno, and the police chief in Reno at that time was very good at he had what do you call it, photographic eye. He really remembered faces very well, and he I think with some help from the NYPD identified him and took him into custody. And so the cops brought him back to New York, and he gave them information on a lot of murders, but he also implicated the cops as corrupt. But it's very secondhand stuff. I think there was one against whom the allegations were a little more specific, and still not prosecutable. But he kind of gradually drifted out of the department, I would say. But the others, no. In general, the Italian squad was quite honest at a time when there was really widespread corruption. Part of that is ethnic tribalism. You don't trust somebody from another ethnicity to be part of the pad. So I think they were probably just cut out of it. There was very systemic corruption. The police precinct commander would have plainclothes officers whose job it was to go out and pick up payoffs. Okay, it was they weren't involved in that kind of thing. Another big case at the time was Correo broke a case in which a ring was doing bombings for hire. This was a multi-ethnic ring. They would do some bombings for people who were making black hand threats, and they admitted to 35 bombings in the first 9 months of 1913. 35 of the 130 bombings that were in New York City during those 9 months. So we're seeing some pretty important cases. And the last of the detectives I'd like to tell you about is Michael Fiaschetti. One of his biggest cases came in 1918 in Akron, Ohio. There was a case where 4 police officers were murdered in 3 separate shootings, all the work of one particular gang. How does Fiaschetti get involved? Well, there was a couple of guys who got away and came to New York, and one of them had been shot in the hand by another member of the gang. I think they were kind of threatening him to keep quiet. So the detective chief in Akron wrote to New York and said, look for the man with the hole in his hand. And so in this period, they love this. This is the golden age of detective fiction. And so Fiaschetti was able to figure it out from that. He had a lot of informants, and somebody told him where to go. He found that guy and another guy who he realized was probably sent to mind the weak link in the gang and maybe to murder him, right? So they take they escort the prisoners back to Ohio, and on the way, Fiaschetti was very good at getting these guys to talk to him, and he realizes that the guy with the hole in the hand is the weak link, and talks him into testifying, and then he gets the other guy to talk to. They do make a case there, and it was a huge thing for Fiaschetti. At a certain point, the NYPD did restart the Italian squad officially with Mike Fiaschetti as the commanding officer. And one of his most publicized cases involved the good killers. Oh, this is a different case. It's a kidnapping, terrible case. So Fiaschetti is on the right-hand side of the page, the tall guy with a suspect he's escorting in. And on the other left-hand side of the page, on the guy on the left, is another Italian squad detective. This kidnapping case is really broken by a woman police officer, so I thought we should get that in here. Fiaschetti reached out to the women, what they call the Women's Bureau of the NYPD, and they sent over Ray Nicoletti, who actually was reading about this case and was dying to jump in and help this family, right? So they set her up as the cousin of the mother in this family, and she goes in there and she cooks, she cleans, she sings Neapolitan love songs, and most importantly for the police work, she sees that a guy who lives across the street keeps looking in. And she says, well, who's that guy? Oh, that's our neighbor. You know, he's a friend of ours. But why don't you invite him in? And he comes over. Anyway, she realizes that he offers to help the family, and she knows that this is what often happens in these black hand cases. The person who shows up to save the day by negotiating with the bad guys is one of the bad guys, right? And this leads to arrests being made, and she's recognized, you know, in all the papers for her detective work, and goes on to a pretty good career. As she's the first Italian policewoman in New York City, also. Unfortunately, Fiaschetti said it was the biggest mistake of his career. First of all, they arrested the suspects who were waiting. They came to get the money or whatever for the payoff, and the suspects, some of them were in the apartment picking up the money, some of them were down the street. They arrest all those guys, and there had been a young, well-dressed guy who was with them, and he just said, oh, I was just stopping by, he was my nephew's whatever, you know, some distant connection, and Fiaschetti let him go. He regretted that later, because that was probably the head of the gang. They never were able to get the head of the gang or to find the boy alive, all right? They brought these guys back to the police headquarters. They beat them and beat them and beat them. It was pretty terrible, and couldn't get anything out of them. Eventually, the boy did turn up dead, drowned. And Fiaschetti, according to his memoir, went back with a baseball bat and beat him up. By writing this in his memoir, which comes out around 1930, it gets him into the first national report on law enforcement, national commission. Periodically we've had national commissions on law enforcement. He's in there as Exhibit A for police violence. There certainly was a degree of violence used, which I talk about in the book. Although, truth is, Fiaschetti was usually the one who can kind of get things from people without it. But in this one case, tragic case. So the case did not end that well. And this is another case called the Good Killers Gang. This man on the right, Bartolo Fontana, is the informant. He was sent to do a murder, and of a guy from Castellamare in Sicily. There was a fight we're starting to get into Mafia territory here. There was a fight between different clans from Sicily, and it spilled over into the United States. Fontana went and did a murder, and then was afraid that he was going to be murdered himself. And so Fiaschetti gets him to talk. Based on that, they make this arrest. Why they lined up the informant with the defendants, I'm not quite so sure. But the guy all the way on the left with the bandage, that's Stefano Magaddino, who becomes a major organized crime figure, real that's a mafia boss, right? Becomes a real mafia boss. We're getting later and later in time now. He attacks Fontana, and you know, he gets beaten up in response. So he was in pretty bad shape when he came for his arraignment. And you see kind of the beginnings of I think you would say the Bonanno crime family with the names there, Bonventri, right, Galante, and Magaddino also, okay. Case went nowhere, though. Multiple murders described in the papers. I think it started at 17 in New York and Detroit. In the newspapers, the count went up to about 125 pretty quickly. I think that detectives in Detroit were clearing their books. And so it really got blown way out of proportion. And furthermore, Fiaschetti, who was kind of a self-promoter, he sold his story told the papers that Fontana had seen the ghost of the man that he killed, and that made him want to testify or something like that. So it was a ghost story on top of everything else. So, like I said, we're in the golden age of crime fiction here. And in writing about this, I had to be very careful to sort through a lot of the facts. But in the meantime, no one puts crime on the front page like Fiaschetti did. I don't think that went over so well with the commissioner and his bosses. At a certain point, I think they pulled the plug on Fiaschetti. They combined the Italian squad into the bomb squad, but put the bomb squad guy in charge. Department politics, the bomb squad guy had been head of the sergeants union. The commissioner of the department had been head of the lieutenants union. I don't think Fiaschetti was the kind of guy who didn't have connections in the department. His connections were with the press. While there, one day, Fiaschetti had made an arrest of a woman who he believed was trying to steal her husband's money in cooperation with the Black Hand. I think he was probably wrong on this one. But he believed the husband's version of it. Here you see how famous Fiaschetti is getting. So he arrests this woman. Shortly before this, the woman's lawyer had come barging in on him in his office, saying, "You can't question her," da, da, da. And Fiaschetti pushed him out, gave him the bum's rush. And this guy, he was an Italian lawyer named Carlino, he had some political connections. Fiaschetti got demoted right down to patrol. I mean, he was like legendary, not just in New York, but across the country. Papers couldn't believe it. Roughing somebody up was not considered that big an offense, I think, but it was enough in this case. And he hangs on and does a little work for the DA, but that was kind of the end of his career. And I think with it, really the end of the Italian squad, which is kind of a shame in that I think Fiaschetti could have been very good in helping to investigate the early beginnings of what we would call true Italian mafia presence in the United States. Joe Masseria, I think, would you call Joe Masseria the first boss, Jeff? Some people do, right? His picture's in the museum. He had a gang on Christie Street that was pretty close by to where there was sort of like a stock exchange of liquor trades being made about a block or two from police headquarters. And I think that, you know, some real investigation might have, I don't think it could have blunted what was happening with, you know, Prohibition, but it might have helped at a critical time. So these guys pop up again. Morello becomes the right-hand man to Joe Masseria, just as Joe Masseria is becoming the first boss. Masseria allied with the remains of the Morello crime family. Lupo's released from prison early. President Harding commuted his sentence to the shock of the Secret Service agents who found that out. So one point I'd like to make in closing is that the Italian squad detectives, they were really on the cutting edge of one of the major issues of their day, and some would say ours too, immigration and crime, right? Heavily debated. They got a lot of press. They had very good contacts in the press. The reporters loved them. They tried to use that to advance the idea that it's just a small number of people who are committing these crimes. The great majority of Italians are here to work hard and would make good citizens, okay? At the time, it was a losing argument, really, because in 1924, the laws changed and the migration from Italy in particular is targeted. The quota for it becomes very small at that point. I found quotes throughout the newspapers where they say things like that. Here's an article about Petrosino. They get his name wrong, but you see at the end of it, it does not take an Italian long to save money and contribute his mite to the government. He works hard, his simple pleasures, loves the things, he has simple pleasures, loves the things that are beautiful, and sends his children to the public schools. He is worth enlightening. All right, that was a case that you see Correo makes it, and Vachris and Fiaschetti. It was very important to them. And so part of this is that it's a story about, immigration as well. They were really on the cutting edge, and they were constantly trying to explain Italians to the police and the newspapers, and explain the police to the Italian community. So it was a difficult position to be in. And it's something that continues today. Here you see, was this last year, there's a Lieutenant Joseph Petrosino Association that has an annual dinner, and that has an annual ceremony at Petrosino's grave. And here they are honoring a police officer named Jason Rivera, who was killed in the line of duty. And they're giving flowers to his family there. And just closed off the book with a quote with Jason Rivera's words. He talks about, after he left the police academy, he had written a letter to the commanding officer of the academy entitled, "Why I Became a Police Officer." And he's the son of immigrants from the Dominican Republic. And he was growing up in Inwood, Manhattan. That's at the northern tip of Manhattan, which was and somewhat still is a heavily Dominican neighborhood. And he asked why. He witnessed his brother being stopped and frisked. Asked why. I was too young to know that during that time the NYPD was pulling over and frisking people at a high rate. My perspective on police and the way they police really bothered me. As time went on, I saw the NYPD pushing hard on changing the relationship between the police and the community. This was when I realized that I wanted to be a part of the Men in Blue to better the relationship between the community and the police. And there's a lot of ways to talk about the legacy of the Italian squad, but that's the one I'd like to focus on right now, using his words, that their story of the Italian squad really does show the importance of good police-community relations, and that remains an issue now still. There's a lot of other ways to look at them, firsts that they kind of gave us, but that's the one I'd like to close with. So thank you for being so attentive. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul. It was really interesting. We have a few minutes to take a few questions. And then also, Paul's book is available for purchase out in the courtroom waiting room. If you'd like to get one, he'd be happy to sign it for you. So first of all, any questions? I want to take those. Yes, here in the front. Well, we're going to bring a microphone up to you.
Hi, I was wondering if you could clarify the relationship between the Black Hand, the Mafia, and some of the other Italian criminal organizations that existed in New York City at that time.
Right. In newspaper terminology, Black Hand was used as a term that applied to all Italian crime. That's how you'll see it used. I would say that technically, Black Hand crime is not usually connected to the Mafia yet in that period of the earliest 1900s. It's not connected to the Camorra yet, which is the organized crime organization in Naples, right? And it's just kind of a catch-all term for a certain type of crime more than really the name of an organization. I think that's the way to think of it. There were Black Hand gangs all over the place, but they weren't connected.
They weren't connected, and a Black Hand group could technically be one person, because they could be sending a letter to someone and make it seem like they have a whole gang behind them.
It could be that guy who was looking through the window across the street. You know what happened in that case? That the family had bought a car, a used car, which at that time was a big event in the street, right? And people thought they had come into a lot of money because their son had been hurt in a traffic accident and was and they thought was going to get a big settlement. They actually hadn't gotten the settlement. The mother made a mistake of telling a neighbor, "Oh, we could have afforded a much better car if we wanted." She was boasting, okay, but that became on the street. Oh, they've gotten their settlement. They've got a lot of money now, and that's what made that particular family a target. Yeah.
All right, very good. Well, please, another round of applause for Paul.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you.